When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite. Looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Layer Games. That's right, Scorpion Layer Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Layer Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
What does everybody want?
Hi, I'm former WWE superstar Al Snow, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.
What does everybody need? What does everybody love?
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, this next guest is no stranger to our airwaves, but he's got an interesting book out now, which is on top of a list of projects he has been a part of. But definitely wanted to touch on this one, and it's called A Decided Novelty, The Essential Guide to Black Pro Wrestling, 1880 to 1950. The author is Ian Douglas. Ian, how are you?
I'm doing wonderfully. How are you?
I can't complain. But before we touch on book and gaga of wrestling and stuff, I was thinking about this before when I was laying down a little bit, trying to relax. And I'm not saying one way or the other, political, all that stuff. But I thought of you because you would be a perfect person to talk with on this, or at least this question anyway, because you check off several of the boxes.
Okay.
And that being, because you worked in media and have some sort of media connection, also as a father of a young child and stuff. We recently heard about the stuff going on with PBS and all that stuff, Sesame Street. Yeah, it's all connected to that from a financial standpoint. And what are your thoughts with that kind of thing? Because obviously, like I said, you have a young child that would fit in a Sesame Street age, but also just everything around that.
Oh, John, you've got me at a huge disadvantage here because I honestly don't know a thing about the issue. You're going to have to educate me here because I
Well,
generally do my best to to ignore the news.
okay. Well, and I know it's not something we were prepared to talk with, but
That's
like I
all right.
said, it was something that came across my mind about a half hour ago. But apparently, and I want to get the term right, but the main funding, like PBS, because there's government withdrawal of the money. There, all right. So yeah, there was certain people that in office that and Republicans and stuff that aren't a fan of putting money into. And the term I was thinking of was Corporation for Public Broadcasting that is shutting down
Hmm.
by the end of the year. Uh, most of their production and stuff by the end of September. Then they'll have a team to help close things out the rest of the year. But I guess my point being with the question though is because I always thought, and even though I don't have kids or anything like that, I am of the generation that grew up with it, like yourself and all, of, public television, whether it be documentaries on PBS. And PBS is a separate thing I should mention, folks, compared to the corporation I just mentioned. But, you have a lot of things that are good for young minds. And I think that, like I said, you and me are both of the generation that grew up with it. You have a young son that's would see we watching that kind of thing, whether it's Dora the Explorer, the Sesame Street, things like that that are educational and I would think right for most children. So, do you see that being the ripple effect? Just seems bad for the educational system and all.
Well, I've got a few thoughts there, and again, this is me just getting or just now catching wind of this and my basic apprehension of the subject matter. And I'm going to approach this from a couple different angles. And thankfully, I'm not running for office anytime soon or ever. So nothing I say here is
What? So it's not going to be Douglas in 2028?
it's not going to be Douglas ever,
Okay.
anytime in your lifetime or mine, if I can help it. If if the Republicans are against it, I'll just say that my basic understanding, and I tend to be pretty moderate. My general takeaway is that things that have tended to lean toward public, whether it's public broadcasting, whether it's public radio, have more often than not skewed liberal and Democrat in my lifetime. And I think that and and this is me having no dog in the fight. I think for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And if the understanding that most Republicans have is that public broadcasting and the people behind public broadcasting are against them, then when they are in power, it becomes easier to withhold funding from those institutions than it is to attempt to reshape and mold those institutions in their image or to shape them to their interests. So I'll say I'm not surprised that with Republicans in charge of government for all intents and purposes, that sort of a thing would happen. And it it's difficult to say I blame them if they've been framed as the opponents to public broadcasting for so long. Now, I will also say part of me doesn't think it's part of me doesn't think it would be a massive loss to most people. I mean, there are some for whom it would be it would be a major loss. But you mentioned that I have a son. He's now 2 years and 4 months old. We have never had the television on.
Okay.
I need to be well. I need to be careful in how I say this because the television screen is on. It's airing YouTube. It's airing Miss Rachel on YouTube. It's airing super simple songs. We're running a bunch of stuff that is educational, and there are so many people doing educational programming, whether it on YouTube or online, uh, whether it's programming that has a great deal of personal funding behind it, or even if it's just somebody reading um, The Hungry Hungry Caterpillar. I think that's what it's called. The
Yeah.
Hungry Caterpillar uh, in front of a screen in their basement. There are plenty of ways nowadays for kids to get educational programming aside from programming that's subsidized by the government. So if public broadcasting goes the way of the dodo, I think it would be on the one hand unfortunate, but I also think there are so many workarounds nowadays that it isn't the loss that it would have been if it happened uh, 30, 20, or even 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just want to get your thoughts because obviously you and your wife are very well educated. You guys do a strange concept, and I know at least you. I never met your missus, but and this is why I think you're super intelligent as well. And you fall into the same category as me. And I like to quote President Clinton from time to time from his autobiography. And you probably heard me say this, but there's a thing he says, and hey, you know what? I know what I don't know. And if I don't know something, I will reach out to somebody. And it doesn't matter the politics all. If
Mhm.
somebody knows something that I don't know and I need to know it, I will talk to them. So,
Yeah.
or I will do my research and whatever.
Yeah, I used to work for Michigan's House Speaker, Andy Dillon, when he was the House Speaker, and he was a accounting genius, financial wizard, and there were plenty of things about the running of the state government that he didn't know when he was elected House Speaker, and that's why you appoint department chairs that you trust. That's why you hire knowledgeable people on your staff to who specialize in different aspects of the running of government, and you trust them, and they can inform you in the areas of government that you don't have a true apprehension of. The worst thing that you can do is act like somebody who went to school and majored in everything, because then you're going to get yourself in trouble. And that's why the running of government, an effective government, has always been a team effort.
Absolutely. And the part of the book that I'm referencing with Clinton, if people, because I know had people ask me about this because I've quoted this publicly. He's talking about the when he first got into office, the first term, and what was the big thing at the time, budgeting and all that fun stuff. And it's like, and he was saying, "Hey, I know I'm a smart guy, but I'm a smart guy because I'm willing to, whether it's Democrat, Republican, whatever. If I need to call an Alan Greenspan or I need to call this or that to run the ideas, but okay, this is what I'm thinking to correct this issue. What do you think X, Y, and Z? And having those conversations to try to make the best decision possible, not only government wise, but just everything, if that makes sense.
Oh, sure. I remember when I first joined state government, and I had to speak with some of the legislative policy staff, the people who handled the actual drafting of the bills. And they would tell me that they had plenty of state reps who ran on issues locally, like for example, any product made in Michigan, there should be no taxes on that item, like period. And they ran on it, they won, and then they get to state government, talk to the legislative policy staff, and then and then that person is forced to inform them of all the reasons that that sort of a bill could never pass. You couldn't even construct it because of all of the levels on which goods and services are taxed. So, uh, yes, there are plenty of people who run for office and they make promises that they don't know that they could never deliver on because having never been elected to office before, they don't understand the intricacies of policy that would prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and
Which is why you have to have people present who actually know what's going on and know more than you do in some cases.
yeah, that's not the issue today, obviously, because that drives me nuts, on a national level and stuff. You hear people run on stuff. It's like, you do realize that's not feasible because we need to do certain things to keep the motor running, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that's not why we're here today. But you got the new book. And yeah, let's go to the fun gaga and all that, as Pat Patterson and all would say.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, you are a Hall of Fame writer as well, and I heard you quote it in other areas, and I think you've even said it to me before on a public stage. So there was you get the election to the Hall of Fame and stuff as an author,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And you're looking around at your contemporaries that are both with you getting the honor, but also ones who maybe have passed, et cetera, et cetera. And you go, self, hey Ian, you're speaking to yourself, hey Ian, you are one of few, if not the only Black author in this class or in this community. Shouldn't I have something of recognition to say I helped not only the culture but the topic itself in professional wrestling? Can you talk
Yeah.
about the thought process with that?
Oh, sure. Oh, there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that were going on there. But the one you're alluding to, you're 100% correct. Pro
A
Wrestling,
sense of responsibility is what I was thinking of.
yeah, the Pro Wrestling Authors Hall of Fame. If you completed 4 books of a certain type of a certain length, you're in. And so it wasn't collections of match reviews from old Raws that were previously published online, and someone decided to compile them and throw them up on Amazon and sell them as an ebook. Um, it was biographies with notable figures, or of notable figures. It was autobiographies with people who were considered significant figures in wrestling, uh, histories of pro wrestling territories, histories of pro wrestling arenas, and things that just met a certain spirit of most people's understanding of what a book should be and what a true author or co-author is when you think of an author or co-author, and when you consider what a book is usually. So not a picture book, for instance, or not.
So I'm out of the case then, because most of these are picture. Most of these behind me are picture books. I'm screwed. No.
No, stop it. But yeah,
Right.
or not just a scrapbook you assembled and
Yeah.
here's all the stuff. Now call me an author. Like not that sort
Yeah,
of
I know
stuff.
where you're going with that.
Yeah, stuff that took a considerable amount of writing and more than likely a lot of research.
Go
So
figure.
so I'm on that list with 29 other people. I think it was like 27 white, 2 Japanese, and me. And so I'm looking at the list and I said, "Oh, wow. Okay. I'm the black guy. On the one hand, that's cool. On the other hand, that's frightening." And then I was thinking, okay, if and then after that, I did have some people, friends primarily, who were in the space saying things like, "Well, you're okay. You're the best black wrestling author of all time." And then I said, "Okay, well, that's nice, but if I am that guy, then are there certain responsibilities that I have? And if I was years from now evaluating someone who had that title, what would I expect? What would I expect from them? Now, I think it's great that I came in the game working with Dan Severn and Hornswoggle and Brian Blair and Bugsy McGraw and Steve Kern, because you don't want to get slapped with the label straight out of the gate, or really ever. You don't want to get slapped with the label of he's the black guy who does the black stuff and he doesn't deviate from it, or you don't want to get pigeonholed that way.
But the list you just mentioned, and obviously I'm very familiar with that list, it's such a variety of things, so you can't be pigeonholed.
Correct. Now I can't. I'm saying if I came straight out of the gate with here's Black Book number 1, Black Book number 2, and Black Book number 3, if there was that perception, then people might have been more reluctant to work with me. I mean, at least that's the way I think about it. So I think it's good that I was doing this for almost 10 years, working on other projects before I came out with the Jack Claiborne and Rufus Jones book, and then released this book, A Decided Novelty. But that was it. That was my motivation, from the sense of a responsibility, but also the fact that I had a general interest in the subject matter, and I just wanted to know. When I was on the elementary school playground in 1987, 1988, and people were saying things like, well, if you get in a fight with Ian, don't hit him in the head because his head is likely to be harder than yours. So you might want to hit him or kick him somewhere else. Okay, that is a stereotype that they got from watching wrestling. I mean, they'd even reference Junkyard Dog. So okay, where does that come from? What's the origin of that stereotype? How did that start? So, and those were the sorts of questions that was one of the questions that I was interested in answering in this book, is how did these sorts of stereotypes of what a black wrestler was and is, how did they begin, and how were they disseminated throughout the wrestling industry, to the point where in 1983 or 84, Rocky Johnson and Tony Atlas get together as the Soul Patrol, guys who pretty much did not interact in their development until they got to New York, but they both have, I mean, if you squint, they both have more or less the same style. Boxer shuffles, big right hands, leaping headbutts, and flying drop kicks, and along with the muscular physique. That's the schema for a black wrestler at the time. It's no accident that they both wound up with something bordering on the same style, even though they were raised and trained and appeared thousands of miles apart for the most part in their career. So those are the sorts of things I was interested in exploring.
And yeah, I'd had to. There's a story with that, but I don't think. I'll bring it up. What the hell? With the Soul Patrol that you're talking about, with Rocky Johnson and Tony Atlas, and I always heard that it was a story apparently that Rocky would tell during that time period, and supposedly those two didn't get along for reasons that I think are out there for whatever reason. People can look that up. But apparently when they had that short run as tag champs in New York, and their credit being the first black tag champs, et cetera, et cetera. There. So on that level, because they were making the national push on cable, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly, and I understand why, because of the relationships that were there previously and since, was the Wild Samoans, I believe it was the Samoans that they won the belts from, right?
Yes.
Okay. making sure I got my time frame right.
Mhm.
Apparently, the Samoans had issues with Tony, but they were willing to do more business with Rocky because of either the family relationships, the personal relationship with him, etc. Is there a truth to that
Uh,
that you know of?
without knowing the specifics, Rocky was a huge star, of course, in San Francisco, where he was working with High Chief Peter Maivia,
Who
where
is
where
yeah.
the Samoans were where Afa and Sika were living at the time. I mean, that's certainly where they became fans. That's where Rocky Johnson meets Adam Maivia and marries her, and they of course have young Dwayne Johnson.
What did he
So
ever do?
yeah, nothing,
Yeah,
absolutely nothing,
right on.
zilch. But yeah, I wouldn't doubt that they would have had an incredible fondness for Rocky Johnson on that basis, that he'd essentially married into the extended Samoan family bloodline, how extended, however you want to frame it, and yeah, had a half Samoan son. That probably goes a long way.
A little bit. All right. So, and I was thinking about this, compressing some notes for our chat today. And this is a little bit of a different route, which I respect, being a guy who studied history, went to school for history, et cetera, et cetera. And the audience, or my audience, knows that. So this book, like I said during the introduction, covers from like 1880 to 1950 range.
Hmm.
Right after the Civil War, but right before the civil rights started taking off. So you got a sweet, say, 70-year period here
Hmm.
of hit chunk of time. And putting together a book like that, and you trying to decide over 20 stars over this period, Jack Nelson, Gorilla Parker, uh, Jack
Hmm.
Claiborne, King Kong
Hmm.
Clayton, etc.
Hmm.
You know, how difficult was it for you in doing the homework? Because with some of the other books that you mentioned and we've talked about in the past, it's not like you could talk to the guys like a Steve Kern, a Dan Severin, etc., and doing your hey, what was going on at this time, and you know what I mean, where you can pick the brains of the subjects themselves.
Uh, so is the question, how difficult was it?
Yeah, how difficult would you say
Okay.
that was? And trying to put factual to what's out there on the internet.
Yeah, it was I would say it made things a whole lot easier. And the reason is because there's so much unexplored territory here that almost anything I put out, like there have been people who put out, um, they might have put out a piece on Jack Claiborne that was 1,000 words long. Uh, Nothing you can do in 1,000 words could come close to doing Claiborne's career any sort of justice. They might have put out something on the original Tiger Flowers, and it covered primarily his time in New York. Well, if you don't know that Tiger Flowers was Joseph Alvin Godfrey, who also wrestled as Ed Flowers in Boston, who was the world middleweight champion in the Boston territory in 1933, and you also don't know that he went on to become the original Rufus Jones and um, was the primary accelerant of the headbutting stereotype, thick-skulled, hard-hitting stereotype amongst black wrestlers, and was
Kind of like what's his name? I'm trying to think. He was out Detroit mostly, the Cocoa Butt.
Bobo Brazil.
Yeah, kind of that type of deal.
Yeah, except 15 years before Bobo Brazil got into the business.
Exactly
Uh,
my point.
oh yeah, you're getting right into my area of consternation here, and we can talk about
We
that.
can,
But
yeah.
but unless you know that, unless you know those two things about him, then the Tiger Flowers piece is essentially worthless. It would be like writing a piece on man. I'm trying to think of a good example. It would be like writing a story about Larry Bird's final year at Indiana State University, and yet you somehow didn't know that he went on to play 13 or however many seasons in the NBA and became one of the all-time greatest and most influential players ever. If you just left it at that sliver and treated it like that was the entirety of his story or his
Hmm.
significance. But okay, sorry. Long
No, you're
digression.
fine.
Long digression, but to answer your question, I felt like I had total freedom, and as long as I did each guy appropriate justice in my mind and got the critical elements of their career recorded and what made them significant so that the reader understood what made them special or what made them stand out, that I'd done my job. And so, I mean, I just looking at the cover of the book and running through the names, like Clarence Bolden, as long as you understand that Clarence was half black, uh, booked as Cuban, likely the people who knew him and managed him thought he was Cuban as well. Won world titles in two weight classes, pinned Frank Gotch, and had Frank Gotch referring to him as the best pound for pound wrestler in the world at one point. If you get that with the understanding that he's black for all intents and purposes, then I did my job because now you understand that there's a black wrestler during this pioneer era who didn't get his due, whose name is worth mentioning to some extent alongside the names of Gotch and Hackenschmidt. If you didn't know who Frank Crozier was, but you understand that he was a Scottish wrestler of Jamaican descent who won the Alhambra tournament in London, the world title tournament in the 19 aughts, and became the first openly black recognized catch as catch can world champion somewhere in the Western world, then you get it. If you know that Jack Claiborne was one of the pioneers of the style that eventually got credited to Antonino Rocca, and that he had a nearly year-long reign as the champion of Hawaii, which was unprecedented in its length for a black wrestler, and that uh, was later more or less ignored in every other territory he went to because they didn't want to give the impression that a black wrestler could have that level of success. Uh, I did my job. Uh, Black Panther Jim Mitchell, if you understand that he was a champion for 3 months in Sandusky, Ohio, of all places, for a belt that didn't last long before he had it and didn't last long afterward, but that he also went to Boston and was one half of the Boston area the AWA Boston World Champions, one half of them with Jim Kelly, not the quarterback, for a short period of time, um, making him more than likely the first black wrestler to be one half of any world championship labeled tag team combination. Uh, then I did my job, and so I mean I don't know that I have more than 15,000 words dedicated to Mitchell, Claiborne, Jones, or Sealy Samara each in this book, but viewing it as a historical tome and seeking to educate as much as I was seeking to entertain, if not more so, it was about having the reader conclude their engagement with the book, realizing or having a comprehension of Black pro wrestling history that didn't begin with the original Reginald Siki and end with Bobo Brazil with absolutely nothing in between.
Right on. And quickly, I want to shout out Callahan Auto of Sandusky, Ohio.
Oh my God.
We love you out there.
Mm-hmm.
No, all kidding aside. And
Tommy
what I
Boy.
was, what's, yeah, of course, I got a reference when you say Sandusky, Ohio. No, but you mentioned a good point I found there in that interesting epilogue, I guess we can call it, or answer.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, and I'm sure there were many more as well, with Clarence Bolden, for example, where you say he was thought of as Cuban, et cetera, but really has the black ties for obvious reasons. Was that mixed up a lot besides him in the guys you featured in this period? Because if we're going to tell the history, let's tell the history for what it is, not the Russell and deal. Oh, this guy is part Samoan or this guy is part Cuban. You know what I'm saying? It's if we're going to tell that history, let's be honest about who they are, what they are, etc. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't find that happened a great deal, or really ever in the case of you had a partially black wrestler who was presented as white or being some other ethnicity. Now, there were infinite cases of clearly black wrestlers or African American. The definite people have varying definitions of African American. The most common is black born in the United States of African slave descendants. If you have
Okay.
African slave ancestors and you were who were in the United States and you were born of them, you're African American. Some people dispute that. A lot of academics abide by it. That's the definition I tend to use.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. What does Ian
So
Douglas go by?
that's what I generally use, and I think it's the most respectful way to frame it because I'm half Bahamian,
Okay.
and I'll make the distinction. My mom is from the Bahamas, and I think it's disingenuous for me to do something and claim it as an African American achievement when someone who was born in the United States of African slave ancestry, um, I to put it another way, I view it along the lines of, black is your way of saying that something is an achievement of somebody of any part African ancestry, but and for in the same way, Asian you could apply it to someone of any part Asian ancestry, but distinguishing between African American and Bahamian American or Jamaican American is equivalent to distinguishing between Chinese American and Korean American.
Mhm.
And those two groups would not want to be lumped together.
Yeah.
And I view it the same. But you had Sealy Samara. He gets the name because he's wrestling in Montreal as Zelis Amhara and he's being billed as Ethiopian. And then he goes to the more friendly alliteration of Sealy Samara. But at different times, he's Ethiopian, he's Algerian, he's Moroccan. The same thing, oddly enough, happened. Well, okay. The original Reginald Siki, he gets the name because Battling Siki is a legendary Senegalese boxer in that era. And so he takes the name Siki and he's billed as a Senegalese cousin of Battling Siki until Battling Siki dies. And then he becomes Ethiopian and everything else for the remainder of his career. But they also pinned Mitchell with that. They pinned that on Lee Umbles for a while, and Rufus Jones even got his fair share of it as well. So yeah, you had plenty of instances where the the ethnic origins of African American wrestlers were obscured for the sake of making them more exotic. This was an era where it was more or less like the circus, and if they're bringing you out to Montana, there was a low likelihood in some Montana towns at that point in time that many of the residents had ever even seen a black person in person, period.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the odds that they've ever seen an Ethiopian? Pretty low. So
Even lower, yeah.
you advertise an Ethiopian for your show, and now you have people, even if they're not interested in wrestling, they're willing to show up just to view an Ethiopian firsthand.
Yeah. Absolutely. And in those days, it would have been on the old boxing rings and things like that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Reginald Siki. Is there any ties, or is it just the wrestling gaga with Sweet Daddy Siki years later?
Zero.
Okay.
Sweet Daddy Siki, rest in peace. Sweet Daddy Siki, as far as I can tell, he gets the name from Reginald Siki after Reginald Berry dies. Sweet Daddy Siki also, I mean, when he debuted as Reginald Siki, not even Junior, just the new Reginald Siki. And he was using the acrobatic style of Jack Claiborne right after Claiborne had been phased out of the business, more or less. So, in my view, and this may be uncharitable of me, and that's fine. There are plenty of people who love him, and I'm sure they have their reasons. But from a historical standpoint, after the research that I've done, I'm viewing him as more or less like a two-part. What's the word I'm looking for? Not imitation, but it trends in that direction. That he has the one legendary wrestler's name who died in 1948, December of 1948, Reginald Siki. And then he has the other wrestler's style, Jack Claiborne, who died in 1960 and was essentially phased out of the business by 1956. So in a lot of ways, he was a poor man's version of both wrestlers, at least when he started out.
Right on. What is, with your research, would you say, or what would you say the telltale signs are of remains of these generational early pioneers, whether it's move sets that might have been forgotten or specific contributions?
Well, wrestling has become so, I mean, homogenized isn't the word. Nowadays, anyone is welcome to borrow anything from anyone whenever they like and incorporate it into their repertoire. But it was into the 1980s. It was very clear when you have okay. Let's go through the progression of the headbutt, because
Okay.
that will help tell the story. Like, you had plenty of people, at least in the eastern US, who used headbutts. That even when you get into like 1954, 50, it was a Gus Sonnenberg move. Good Michigan man, Gus Sonnenberg, originally. And he made the move very popular in the Boston area. But even in the early to mid 1950s, there were plenty of pockets of territorial pro wrestling where the headbutt had never even been introduced. And when it was, there was a lot of ambiguity surrounding its legality. Like, is this even a legal move for the wrestlers to be using? Because people were familiar with boxing, and headbutting is obviously a foul in boxing.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jim Mitchell, there are examples of him using headbutts in his bouts early on, like 1932, 33-ish. Not excessively, and it looks like he quickly stopped using them. probably because it was a move that was associated with heels. Because again, it has that um, it's been colored as an illegal move that was taken from boxing. Uh, but Rufus Jones, the original, who is a heel, it's a perfect move for him.
Mhm.
And he starts using the headbutt in 37 or 38, and its usage only escalates as his body begins to deteriorate in terms of his athleticism. So he's using it through the 1940s. And then in 1946, Jim Mitchell goes out to the Northeast. He's wrestling in both Boston and Maine. And this one is weird because in Boston, he's wrestling as the Black Panther, Jim Mitchell. Everybody knows who he is. In Maine, he's wrestling as the Black Panther and he's wearing a black mask and he's being referred to as an East Indian wrestler. The same name, wrestling not all that many miles apart, but in one place he's a black wrestler, in the other place he's an East Indian wrestler, and in Maine, under the mask, he's also a prolific headbutter. That's when he starts using excessive headbutts. Um, Eventually, he takes the mask off and he keeps using the headbutts. And then in late 1946, early 1947, he heads out to California. He retains the style and he starts headbutting everybody in sight in California while alongside Reginald Siki, who's still wrestling as the hyper technical wrestler he had almost always been. So it's still not this universal style that's used by everyone. Then in late 1948, Jack Claiborne gets the championship in Hawaii. And this is a guy who is used to doing flips and throwing anywhere from 5 to 15 drop kicks a night. And all of a sudden, he starts incorporating jumping headbutts from a standing position into his matches. And so suddenly, Jim Mitchell had been the technician of the quartet being Mitchell, Rufus Jones, Seeley Samara, and Jack Claiborne. Mitchell had been the technician. Now he's a headbutter, along with the heel Rufus Jones, and Jack Claiborne, who was a beloved babyface 99% of his career. He's the acrobat and the natural athlete of the group. He also starts throwing headbutts. He famously wrestles Seeley Samara while Claiborne is the champion in Hawaii. He also defends the Negro title against Seeley Samara in Hawaii, defeats him. He's using all sorts of headbutts in those matches. And then after Samara loses to Claiborne, Samara leaves, goes back to the northeastern U.S. And Samara had been the strong man of the quartet, and all of a sudden, Samara is throwing headbutts in every single match. So within a 3-year period, it spread like a virus. The four most influential black wrestlers of the era all start using headbutts excessively in all of their matches. And it becomes this stereotype and this expectation. Guys like Don Kindred start headbutting. Guys like Frank James start headbutting. I don't see anything about Don Blackman headbutting, but he also gets out of the business pretty soon. And so then by the time you have Bobo Brazil, Bearcat Wright Jr., and Sweet Daddy Siki. By the time the three of them are all firmly established as pro wrestlers, all three of them are also headbutting excessively, and now it's the norm amongst pretty much all black wrestlers.
Right on. Yeah, I love playing connect the dots with, the history of things, and that certainly makes sense.
Yeah, so you get to mid-80s WWF, and obviously you have Junkyard Dog, Butch Reed is throwing his fair share of headbutts. Coco Beware is also doing the spot occasionally when you ram his head into the turnbuckle and it has no effect on him, and then he hits you with a jumping headbutt or two. So yeah, even through the 1980s, less so in the 1990s, but certainly through the 1980s, you clearly have that style still pervading pro wrestling amongst
You
black
know
wrestlers.
that I just, and this is more wrestling ethics I would consider than a race thing. And yeah, you talk about the headbutt with guys like, say, you get into the '80s in the WWF. You have Junkyard Dog, you have Coco, you have Butch Reed a little bit in that mix. But when you had, because there's another rule, and I'll bring that up in a second. Yeah, ethically, there's you got guys. Wouldn't that be gimmick infringement at some sort? You know, you have three different, say, black characters there, and have variation of things. Using like if technically if a move was set up for somebody in a territory, you didn't steal their get like if you and me were there with Shawn Michaels, we would you and me wouldn't be using the super kick, say. You know where I'm going with that?
Hmm.
Does that make
Yeah.
so when we're talking the headbutt per se that you were just talking about, you have these three different guys there in the territory that cross paths. Wouldn't somebody have said, "Hey, only one of you can use the headbutt"? If that make, or is it was that only just for say a finish?
Yeah, I think that was primarily with respect to a finish. But it's interesting you bring that up because when we go back before Rufus Jones died, he didn't really have anybody who was headbutting alongside him. Now, there were a couple standout matches where uh, almost it seems like it was almost as a comedy spot where um, Rufus Jones might headbutt somebody, and then that person might try to turn around and headbutt Jim Mitchell, and Jim Mitchell would no sell it, and the white guy who headbutted Mitchell would fall to the canvas. Um, so even then, they were even in those matches they were sort of selling. Okay, this is a natural thick-headedness amongst black wrestlers, so to speak. That they were putting that across. But aside from that, it seems like it was limited up until the point where Rufus Jones dies, that only one guy is really allowed to be the headbutter in a territory. And if Rufus Jones is in the territory, then you don't get to use that style. Now, when Rufus Jones dies in the car wreck in fall of 1951, all of a sudden it's like it was open season
Yeah,
on his gimmick. And then you end up with Frank James and Don Kindred teaming up as the Brown Bombers in Utah and in the Pacific Northwest and winning two sets of tag team championships as the Brown Bombers. And they're like their entire act is based on the style of Rufus Jones. Like that's where he was when he died. Those were the last two territories he wrestled in, and there was still a lot of demand for him and his style. So they just both rolled into town as a pair of Rufus Jones, and almost in his honor won these championships that had eluded him during his career.
right on. Now, obviously, like I said, and the book is a decided novelty, and obviously, I've heard folks in the past say, and I believe it was Thunderbolt Patterson. I'll use him as an example. And, you know, I know sometimes some people say things about Thunderbolt for whatever reason. He was negative, he was this, he was that, whatever. But I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was Thunderbolt that was quoted for this as well. And after I heard it, it made sense when you look at the territorial history. And I know that's more modern on a scale of things compared to the book. But like say if one there was always typical the stereotypical one black wrestler in a territory. So let's say Thunderbolt was in Mid South, say, and then here comes Junkyard Dog.
Ernie Ladd.
Yeah, or an Artie Ladd. You know what I'm saying? That if one was there, if another one came in, you knew the one who was there was on his way out.
Mm-hmm.
Was that always the standard practice in your research, or was that more the modern?
Um, Not necessarily, but you also had it. It was pretty clear that there were some promoters in some cases where you didn't, where they didn't have black wrestlers on the cards, period. And we get into this a lot during the book. One of Don Blackman's primary claims to fame is taking black wrestling south of the Mason-Dixon line, where he and Don Kindred are suddenly the true main event in the late 1940s in Virginia. And then the original Jim Crockett is bringing Don Blackman and Buddy Jackson into North Carolina and South Carolina, and then also back through parts of Virginia, and they're the true main event for the novelty of having two black wrestlers on the card. Sam Mushnick, when he first breaks away from Tom Pack and starts promoting his own shows in St. Louis, he brings in King Kong Clayton and Celie Samara to wrestle as what was the true main event in, I think, his first show, and that was for the novelty of having two black wrestlers. And so in those early days in southern states, you needed two black wrestlers just to have someone for them to oppose so that you wouldn't have to contend with a black wrestler wrestling against a white wrestler on the card and getting a racist reaction from some of the fans in attendance. And then Don Blackman has his all Negro tours of the South, where he's going into Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee, and he's bringing Frank James, Alex Kaffner, Buddy Jackson, and a few others with him, and they're running some of the what were probably the first high-level all-black wrestling shows in those areas. But even in especially in Ohio, Michigan, and Ontario, uh, Rufus Jones and Jim Mitchell were partnered up, and the booking may vary one city to the next, even within the same state. So if they were wrestling in Cincinnati, they might have been wrestling in opposition to each other, and then they're they're riding in the same car together. Like, that much is clear because they got in car accidents together and wound up in the hospital alongside each other. But they're riding in the car from Cincinnati to Columbus, and in Columbus, they're tag team partners against a pair of white wrestlers. And then they'll travel north to Detroit, and they're in opposition. And then they cross the bridge into Windsor, and they're on the same team. So whether or not there was only one black wrestler permitted or not, it had a lot to do with the guy running the territory at that time. So it varied somewhat between um, what occurred in the TV era. Now, we have the interview from Jack Claiborne where he talks about how, in his view, TV ruined wrestling in the early 1950s. The reason he says that is because the advertisers in the southern states didn't want black wrestlers on the national programs. So if he was on a show that was being recorded for national television, he would end up wrestling in the dark match that never got broadcast. And so there may have been political pressures that extended into the 60s, and especially the 60s and 70s, where the promoters didn't want to have more than one black wrestler on the card from an optics standpoint, and how the fans and maybe even promoters of the broadcast, if it was on television, might have perceived it.
I, this is something else I was thinking about too, and especially you go into the deep history that you do, Is there somebody in the time period of the book that you would consider a black pioneer? Because when I say that, I'm thinking of, say, obviously, when you talk other sports, like say if Fritz Pollard from the NFL in 1920 or a Jackie Robinson in 47, etc. Is there somebody in this early period for professional wrestling, or would that be more of a modern day?
Um,
That
Pioneer and pinning it on one guy, it's absolutely it's it's almost impossible. You could say Reginald Seekey, Reginald Barry, the original Reginald Seekey. The reason I'm reluctant to do it, and I mean this hurts to say, um, because in the way that we think of Jackie Robinson as a pioneer in baseball, uh, Jackie Robinson was incredible. He breaks the color line, and within a few years, he's a National League MVP.
yes.
So he's a great athlete. He's a winner. He's MVP, and he's a World Series champion. Um, Reginald Seekey is broken in nationally by the Zabiscos and their like traveling all-star carnival circus where everyone is treated like they're an all-star.
This is not the Zabiscos. This is more, think of the modern era, correct?
No, this is Stanislaus and Wyatt
Yes.
Zabisco. Yeah. Um, so he's traveling around with them, and him having a so Reginald Seekey having a groundbreaking match is wrestling for 30 minutes and looking competent, even though he loses 2 falls to 0 or 2 falls to 1. So if you look at his win-loss record, if you were to grade him that way between 1922 and say 1932 or 33 before he gets serious about relocating to Europe, his win-loss record would have been abysmal. You probably have 80% losses, if not more. And so it's he's a pioneer in the sense of representation, but as far as wrestlers being given an opportunity to win. So the lost pioneer is George Godfrey, the boxer, because George Godfrey is one of the top 5 heavyweights in the world at the time where he gets essentially banned for throwing too many fights that he probably would have won and should have won. He probably, if he hadn't taken money for dives and the judging was fair and square, he probably is the world champion at some point between Jack Johnson and Joe Louis. But he gets banned in certain circles of major pro boxing. So he goes to Mexico, wins the Mexican heavyweight boxing championship, decides he wants to wrestle, comes back, starts appearing on the East Coast in a bunch of wrestling matches, drawing 4,500 fans to different venues, outdrawing Jim Lundis in some cases at wrestling events. And all of a sudden it seems like promoters get the idea, oh wow, people are willing to spend money to see a black wrestler who's already a celebrity from another sport, but to see a black wrestler dominate a white wrestler. So that's not the impediment that we thought it would be. And now it's sort of like they have the green light to present black wrestlers as being truly competitive and giving them wins over white wrestlers or wrestlers of other races and ethnicities. So, in terms of a single pioneer, it's hard to do. But as far as representation, it's Seeky. As far as providing the impression, giving promoters the confident that they could book black wrestlers to be winners, it was George Godfrey. And then the guys who sort of spread that across the U.S., the four pioneers there, I would say, are primarily Jack Claiborne, Celie Samara, Jim Mitchell, and Rufus Jones, with honorable mention to King Kong Clayton and Gorilla Parker.
Right on. Now, and I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to bring up, because I thought this was cool, and I know you were excited for it, but recently you did stories with Briscoe and Bradshaw, which I got to hear most of it recently. How exciting! I know you were super excited to be able to talk to two legends like that about the book and other things. So, would you say that's probably the biggest you've done to, I guess, some modern wrestling, or excuse me, try this in English, to a modern wrestling fan who maybe is not well versed in the history, like myself, you, and Evan Ginsberg, Brian Young, etc., Brian Solomon?
I think my interview with Meltzer was up there
Okay.
when we did Gentleman Jack and Rufus Jones. But yeah, as far as getting two guys that are in the wrestling mainstream, and by the way, I had Gerald Briscoe's address. I sent him the book, and the reason I sent Gerald Briscoe the book, because at the time I sent it, it wasn't registering with me that he had the podcast. Now, I'd seen the podcast. I've seen several interviews on his show with Bradshaw. The reason I sent the book is because Gerald is very strongly connected with the National Wrestling Hall of Fame and Museum in Iowa.
Yes.
He's on the board, and I thought it was important to get some of these guys on his radar for a potential future induction. In fact, since this book got published, I've had several members of Clarence Bolden's family reach out to me.
That's
And
awesome.
I put them in touch with Gerald Briscoe. I put them in touch with Brian Blair at the CAC. And I'm hoping that at least one of those organizations will do something for Clarence Bolden and hopefully some of these other guys as well. But that's why I sent Gerald Briscoe the book. And then all of a sudden he's messaging me and Bradshaw's messaging me, and they want to interview me for their podcast. And Briscoe told me that he'd started reading the book, he loved it, and gave it his highest recommendation and wanted Bradshaw to read it as well.
Did you know Gerald at all before you sent him the book, or?
I met Gerald 2 years ago in Charlotte during one of the gathering events. We were talking about, I'm friends with Mike Rotunda. We were talking
Yes.
about Gene Mills, who is the Syracuse wrestler who is the best in his world in his weight division, and the NCAA champion and All-American on the same team with Rotunda. But we were talking about that. I went there because Steve Kern, Bugsy McGraw, and Brian Blair were all there at the same time, and I felt like I needed to say hi and got
Yeah.
to sign books in Bugsy's booth, which was pretty cool. But yeah, that's when I met Gerald Briscoe, and that was really the end of it. And then Steve Kern gave me Gerald's address because he wanted me to send Gerald a copy of his latest book when it got released. So that's why
Okay.
I had it. But yeah, this was my first time having a conversation with Gerald that lasted more than 3 minutes. And it was nice to see him so excited about the book and the content.
Right on. Now, on that episode, there's a couple of things you mentioned there.
Yeah.
And first was you mentioned earlier about your mom being from the Bahamas.
Yep.
So you would get out that way, and you actually talked about, as a child, I should say, you got out that way and you had a chance to see guys like Big Steel Man, who was Fred Ottman, and Dusty, and the Nasty Boys and stuff out there in the island. And in your mind at the time as a child, you thought of the WWF and the arenas and things like that. So How cool was that to see it on a smaller scale for you?
Yeah, I was blown away because I didn't realize that you could set up pro wrestling in an environment outside of a big arena. I wasn't raised in a territory system where you'd set up a wrestling ring in a high school gym, and that was fine. Um, and even now, when I'm doing research for other projects, and it's 1882, and at county fairs they're putting the wrestlers on boats and having them do best of five falls, and it ends up being a disqualification because both guys fall off the boat and into the water, and they start trying to drown each other. Um, the Street Fighter 2 fan in me kicks in, where I think it would be cool if somebody did something where my friend Omar Amir, Bahamian wrestler, if he ever signed to AEW and they did a sort of like Fight Club challenge type thing where you have to wrestle him, where you have a wrestling ring set up on a remote Bahamian island right in the middle of the sand, and you do something there, or some wrestler has a blue collar background, and so you do a 15-minute match and you set it up in the middle of an abandoned automotive factory or a stamping plant in Detroit somewhere, and that ends up being 15 minutes of the show, and you use some of the features of the environment and incorporate that into the match, and that ends up being that wrestler's sort of specialty or home match. Um, I think that would be cool. But the reason I bring that up, those are the sort of vibes that I got even then, even though Street Fighter 2 wasn't a thing yet. Those are the sorts of vibes I got even then of like, okay, this is what wrestling is in the Bahamas. And you walk into this open air courtyard, and there's a wire fence set up to catch the bottles and cans and debris that's being thrown at the wrestlers. And it's just great that you can put wrestling in so many different venues, and it takes on a different character that's dependent upon the venue that you put it in.
So they were going with the no holds bar gimmick with Stan Hansen and now I'm teasing. Uh
Well, I mean, the Ottman Dusty Rhodes match was an island death match. I mean, it was really a Texas death match, really, but they went with the island death match thing where you had to beat
yeah,
the 10 count.
yeah. The other thing you mentioned there, which I thought was great, or there's two other things you mentioned there in that episode that I caught was important. You talk about if it's important to you, then it's important to others.
Hmm.
But the other thing you mentioned too, and it makes perfect sense, and you can see the evolution for yourself, any of the readers would be you learned the structure of really putting together a book because your first involvement was with Dan Severin, and we are where we are now with
Hmm.
a dedicated novelty. So could you briefly touch on those?
Oh, sure. The first time you do anything, um, I'm going to steal from legendary Detroit Pistons coach Chuck Daly when he was describing the Pistons championship run in 1989 after they'd been to the finals against the Lakers the prior year and lost in 7 games. Where he said, the first time you do anything, you're just dying for it to be over. But once you've been through it, you understand the process and you can program the money where you know how to get there. And then he said, so we knew at that point, okay, we're going to make it to the finals and we're going to be playing in June because now we know how to get there and we can progress with that confidence. Um, so the first time I wrote a book, which was Severance, and there were a few reasons that it was rushed out, but um, you're trying to get it done for a lot of reasons. I mean, not least of which you have the expectations of the wrestler. You want to make him happy, so let's get a project completed and get it out. But also, and I think this is an unfortunate thing that happens with a lot of authors, and I'm embarrassed to say it happened to me, is that sometimes you're in such a hurry to be known as something that you take the shortest, easiest path to get there. So it was almost like, okay, as soon as we've got an acceptable book ready to publish it, let's publish it. And then, oh, hey, look at me, I'm an author. And that lasts 2 weeks. And then you start thinking, shoot, like I could have done a better job. And if
We
I
all do that in what we do, though.
yeah, well, still, I mean, it's you learn from it, but if I'd taken one more month instead of what 275 pages, I would have fleshed out all these things and it would have been 350. And if we'd done a few more interviews, then you get it to 400 and it's a far more immersive experience. And so I learned from that, and in subsequent books, I didn't make that mistake. Now, at the same time, once I had the title of co-author, now I don't feel like I need to rush something out in order to get that title, and now I feel more like I'm being judged on quality, or at least I'm judging myself on that quality. And so now I'm at the point where I approach it and I want it to be a product that's worthy of, I mean, that the guy I'm working with is proud of, but also casts me in a good enough light where people associate my name with quality, and people who want to work with me are excited to work with me because they know I'm not going to allow something to be released unless it's good. And so now the pressure is off. Now I just take my time, and when it's ready to release the book, I release the book.
And final question for you, because obviously, and I just actually released the episode as we were getting on here,
Hmm.
but and I know you put out a voice memo from him,
Uh-oh.
but the death of Hogan.
Yeah.
What now? The memorial episode we did on him, obviously was just to focus on the in-ring uh, presentation, the character, such because we know, and I'm not here to beat it up because we all know the story that the man Terry Bollea may have been flawed for
Mhm.
obvious reasons. So, where was your head when you heard the news?
Um, no wrestling deaths shock me anymore.
Yeah.
When you understand the era, when you understand what the guys endured, when you understand what the guys partook in, and when I say that, I could mean anything, but in this case, I'm primarily referring to steroids and HGH.
Okay.
And you have plenty of guys involved in bodybuilding who just suddenly drop dead of AFib or a stroke. They have heart attacks, and or something, or their organs are enlarged and but can't adequately pump blood anymore or receive it. And so anyone who did copious amounts of steroids or human growth hormone, when they if they even reach the age of 60, in my mind, they're almost on the clock. Like it's definitely ticking at an accelerated rate. So when I saw that Hogan died and it was the result of a heart attack, I was like, yeah, okay. I mean, it was going to happen eventually. And it was probably going to be as the result of a heart attack. And then, of course, Oliver Bateman hits me up 5 minutes later and said, "Okay, we're already approved to write the Hogan obituary for the Ringer. So let's get started." So at that point, it was just okay, like everyone else we've done this for, it's time to go to work. But no,
Yeah.
there were no surprises. There was no shock.
Well, I'd be remiss to not ask. Do, did you obviously look at him differently with some of the controversial things that were said on the tape and such?
Look at him differently. The problem is the
Like I
problem.
said, the character is one thing, the person was another.
Oh yeah, I mean the problem is I have to think of how I looked at him before that happened. And was I ever a Hogan fan? No, not really. Like I was a Savage fan.
Yeah,
I always wanted Hogan to lose. So I didn't have the great affection or fondness for Hogan that a lot of dyed in the wool Hulkamaniacs had. And so when that audio came out, I said, "Oh, okay, well, that's rough, but what are you gonna do? Like, he's not my friend,
yeah,
and I tend to view these guys as actors, given the era he grew up in, given the place he grew up in. I can't say I'm completely shocked. And then you have, and I will say something that got cut from the Ringer article. Yeah, I wrote it and it got cut, but I think a part of this is in there. I made allusion to the fact that immediately George Foreman and Virgil leapt to his defense and say, "I've known him for 20 years. He can't be racist." Well, the quote is something along the lines of, "Yeah, I guess I'm racist." So I mean, he said he is or was. Are we not allowed to take him at his word? Like I do think he got a level of cover that I can't imagine anyone else receiving if they were white and were caught on tape making a similar statement. I can't imagine another scenario where you have a bunch of black athletes leaping to their defense, insisting that they're not what they personally claimed to be. So I did think that was weird. The idea that he was my friend or he was nice to me, so he can't be racist. I'm going to use a horribly crude analogy, but racial prejudice is usually characterized as the belief that one racial group is superior or inferior to the other groups. So if that's your definition, I think most people, again, it's a crude analogy. I think most people are in agreement that human beings, generally speaking, are superior to dogs. Yet I like a lot of dogs more than certain people. And
hmm
that doesn't mean that I think dogs categorically are superior to people. And so I think it's helpful to hold those two thoughts simultaneously in mind. That first of all, Hogan is a wrestler. Wrestlers are excellent at working people, at smiling in their faces and thinking while thinking something else the entire time. And also, just because you like one group more than another group, doesn't mean you don't like an individual from the group you're prejudiced against more than certain individuals in the group you favor. Those are two different things. So those are my general thoughts on Hogan. And when I talked to him on the phone, it didn't come up. It was all business. When I met him in person, he shook my hand and said, "It's nice to meet you, brother." Uh, he immediately told a lie about Paul Orndorff that I thought was hilarious, and that was it.
yeah. Well, folks, check out the book. We'll have links to Amazon, all that fun stuff. Mr. Douglas, always a pleasure talking with you.
John, it was a privilege being here, man. Thank you so much for having me yet again.
Yeah, we'll talk again soon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hey folks, looking for the ultimate destination for the nerd enthusiasts and collectors? Well, we found the spot for you. Nerds Nest Collectibles is a haven for nerds, geeks, and fans alike, as they have many different products and certainly more to come. Make sure you go ahead and visit them at nerdsnestcollectibles.com. Check them out.
Excuse me! This is Vicky Guerrero, and you're listening to Crazy Train Radio.